Imagine a woman floating towards the church rafters during her own funeral mass. Picture another, whose sources claimed, faced down a whole army of fierce warriors, with nothing but a small sacred container in her hands, causing them to retreat in panic. One holy woman was said to have conversed directly with Jesus, who showed her his own heart glowing like a furnace. These aren't tales from a forgotten storybook. These are accounts written down centuries ago about medieval nuns, women whose lives were reportedly filled with events so extraordinary they were documented as miracles. Number 6, Gertrude the Great and the Heart of Gold. Gertrude, who would later be known as the Great, was born in the year 1256 in Eisleben, a place that would much later also be the birthplace of Martin Luther. At the tender age of just 5, she was entrusted to the care of the Benedictine nuns at the monastery of St. Mary at Helfta in Saxony. This wasn't unusual for the time. Many families placed young daughters in convents for education or a religious life. Helfta was no ordinary convent, though. It was a powerhouse of female spirituality and learning, home to other famous mystics like Mechfild of Hackeborn, who was Gertrude's teacher, and Mechfild of Magdeburg. For many years, Gertrude lived the life of a dedicated student and nun. She was incredibly bright, loved learning, and was particularly skilled in Latin and literature. She studied grammar, rhetoric, and the classical authors with enthusiasm. By her own admission, she was perhaps a little too proud of her intellectual gifts, and maybe a bit too focused on worldly knowledge rather than purely spiritual matters. She later wrote that she had been so taken up with these things that she was blind to God's call. Then, when Gertrude was 25 years old, something happened that changed her life forever. It was the winter of 1281. She described experiencing a profound spiritual crisis, feeling lost and deeply unhappy with her life. One evening, as she was struggling with these feelings, she reported having a vision. She said that Jesus Christ himself appeared to her. He was, in her description, a beautiful young man who spoke to her with immense tenderness. He gently chided her for looking for fulfillment in books and learning when he himself was the source of all wisdom and joy. This was not just a fleeting image. According to Gertrude's own writings, compiled after her death by other nuns of her community in a book called The Herald of Divine Love, Legatus Divinae Pietatis. This was the beginning of a series of intense mystical experiences. Jesus, she reported, continued to appear to her, speak with her, and reveal divine secrets. These weren't just vague feelings. She recounted detailed conversations. One of the most famous and influential aspects of Gertrude's reported experiences centered on the heart of Jesus. Long before the devotion to the Sacred Heart became widespread in the Catholic Church, Gertrude was writing about it with astonishing intimacy. She described visions where Jesus invited her to rest her head near the wound in his side, allowing her to hear the beating of his divine heart. She said, "He showed her his heart, sometimes depicted as a glowing furnace of love, or as a golden censer, or even as a lamp shining brightly." In one particularly striking account, Gertrude wrote about a vision that occurred on the feast of John the Evangelist. She felt a special connection to John, who in the Gospels is described as the disciple whom Jesus loved, and who rested his head on Jesus' chest at the Last Supper. In her vision, Gertrude found herself, along with John, resting on the breast of Jesus. She reportedly asked John how it was that he, having experienced such closeness to the divine heart, had written so little about it in his Gospel. John, according to Gertrude's account, replied that his role was to provide the early church with teachings on the Word made flesh, but the revelation of the sweetness of Jesus' heart was reserved for later times like hers, to rekindle a cooling love in the world. Jesus himself, Gertrude reported, then spoke to her, offering his heart as a golden thurible, a censer for incense, from which she could draw spiritual riches. He told her, "Behold, I offer you the cherished and divine censer of my heart, which is always full of the sweet perfume of every virtue, so that whatever you may perceive to be lacking in your service, you may draw from it." She wrote of Jesus symbolically giving her his heart, or even exchanging hearts with her, a profound mystical concept suggesting an unparalleled union. These experiences weren't just for her own benefit. Gertrude felt compelled to share what she was shown. The nuns of Helfta meticulously recorded her sayings, her visions, and the prayers she composed, which were often directly inspired by these mystical encounters. Her writings emphasized God's immense, merciful love for humanity, a theme that resonated deeply. She wrote about Jesus' desire for a personal, loving relationship with each soul. Gertrude also reported receiving insights into the state of souls in purgatory and the efficacy of prayers for them. She became a spiritual advisor to many, both within and outside the convent, her words carrying the weight of her profound mystical life. Her health was often poor, and she suffered from various physical ailments, but her spiritual life remained intensely vibrant. She passed away around the year 1302, leaving behind a legacy of writings that would influence Christian spirituality for centuries, particularly the devotion to the Sacred Heart. The accounts of her life, filled with these direct, loving encounters with the divine, portrayed a woman who believed she had touched the very heart of God. Number 5. Ida of Nivelles, lost in a world beyond ours. Imagine someone so deeply lost in a spiritual trance that they seem to leave their body behind, becoming completely unaware of the world around them for hours, sometimes even days. This was the reported reality for Ida of Nivelles, a Cistercian nun and mystic who lived from around 1199 to 1231 in what is now Belgium. Her life, though short, was documented as being filled with extraordinary states of spiritual ecstasy that set her apart even in an age accustomed to tales of religious fervor. Ida's story began in Nivelles, a town known for its influential abbey. From a very young age, she was said to have shown a profound inclination towards religious life. At around 16, she entered the Cistercian convent of La Ramea, a place that followed a strict interpretation of the rule of Saint Benedict, emphasizing prayer, silence, and manual labor. It was within this disciplined environment that Ida's unusual spiritual experiences began to manifest and attract attention. The most striking accounts of Ida's life, primarily recorded in her biography, the Vita Idae Nivellensis, written by a contemporary, possibly Goswin of Bosset, a Cistercian monk from Villers, describe her frequent and prolonged ecstasies. These weren't just moments of quiet contemplation. They were profound, all-consuming states. During these episodes, Ida would reportedly become completely insensible to her surroundings. Her fellow nuns could touch her, move her, even prick her, and she would show no reaction. Her body might become rigid, sometimes described as being as stiff as a board, or at other times, unnaturally light. It was said that these trances often came upon her during prayer, especially after receiving Holy Communion, which was a central part of her spiritual life. She had an intense devotion to the Eucharist, believing it to be the literal presence of Christ. After communion, she would often fall into these deep states of rapture that could last for extended periods. Sometimes the nuns would find her in the choir or in her cell, completely still, her eyes perhaps open but unseeing, her mind evidently elsewhere. What was happening to her during these times? According to the accounts, Ida herself, when she returned to normal consciousness, would sometimes speak of what she had experienced. These were not blank periods for her. Instead, they were described as times of intense spiritual activity, filled with visions of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints. She reported being transported to heavenly realms, witnessing celestial events, and receiving divine communications. One specific detail often mentioned was her connection to the Passion of Christ. It was said that during certain periods, especially around the time of Lent or on Fridays, her ecstasies would involve a profound, mystical participation in Christ's sufferings. She would reportedly feel his pains, see the events of the crucifixion, and be overcome with both sorrow and love. Her biographer also noted that Ida seemed to possess unusual gifts, even when not in a full trance. She was said to have a remarkable ability to discern the spiritual state of others, sometimes knowing their secret sins or their hidden virtues without being told. People reportedly sought her out for spiritual guidance, believing she had a direct line to divine wisdom. There's an interesting connection between Ida of Nivelles and another famous mystic of the time, Lutgardis of Iwier, whose stories are also legendary. The two women knew each other. It's recorded that Lutgardis, who was older and already renowned for her own mystical experiences, once visited Ida at La Ramée. This meeting of two such spiritually intense figures must have been quite something. Lutgardis reportedly recognized and affirmed the genuineness of Ida's spiritual gifts. Ida's life was not just about these dramatic ecstasies. She was also described as a humble and obedient nun, dedicated to her community and her religious duties when she was not away in her spiritual journeys. However, these frequent and prolonged absences from normal consciousness were the defining feature of her hagiography. Her fellow nuns were said to have treated her with a mixture of awe, concern, and reverence. They would care for her physical needs when she was in these states, ensuring she was safe. The accounts also mention that sometimes upon returning from an ecstasy, Ida would be physically weak, as if the intensity of the experience had taken a toll on her body. Yet, she continued, to have these experiences throughout her relatively short life. She died at La Ramée at the age of about 32. The stories of her life, particularly the descriptions of her profound and lengthy ecstasies, painted a picture of a woman who lived with one foot in this world and one in a spiritual dimension far beyond ordinary human perception, a soul seemingly lost, or perhaps found, in a world beyond ours. Number 4. Hildegard of Bingen, the nun who saw fiery secrets. Hildegard of Bingen was not your average nun, not even by the extraordinary standards of the medieval period. Born in 1098 in Bermersheim, Germany, to a noble family, she was a writer, composer, philosopher, mystic, visionary, medical writer, and abbess. Her life was a whirlwind of creative and spiritual activity, but it was her incredible vivid visions that truly set her apart and brought her fame and sometimes controversy across Europe. From the remarkably young age of 3, Hildegard reported experiencing visions. She described them not as dreams or products of her imagination, but as something she saw with her waking eyes and heard with her ears while fully conscious. She called this gift the shade of the living light. For many years, she kept these experiences largely to herself, confiding only in her mentor Jutta von Sponheim, the holy woman who educated her, and whom she later succeeded as head of their monastic community. Hildegard was a frail child, often ill, and perhaps she feared being misunderstood or dismissed. It wasn't until she was 42 years old, in 1141, that Hildegard said she received a powerful divine command to write down what she saw and heard. She described it as a fiery light, flashing intensely, that came from the open vault of heaven and poured through my whole brain and heated it like a fire that BWR warms, not like one that burns, but like a flame that warms. Despite her initial hesitation, feeling uneducated and unworthy, she began to dictate her visions to her secretary, the monk Volmar, and a fellow nun, Richardus von Stade. The result was her first major theological work, Scivias, Know the Ways the Lord Gear. This book, which took 10 years to complete, is an astonishing collection of 26 visions. They are complex, symbolic, and cosmic in scope, dealing with the nature of God, the universe, creation, humanity, sin, redemption, and the end times. Her descriptions are filled with extraordinary imagery, figures of dazzling light, strange celestial beings, intricate allegorical structures, and dramatic cosmic events. For instance, she described the Trinity not in abstract terms, but through images like a brilliant light, the Father, a sapphire-hued human figure within it, the Son, and a fiery power permeating all, the Holy Spirit. She saw the universe as a cosmic egg with layers representing different elements and spiritual realities. These weren't just pretty pictures. Hildegard's visions often came with detailed theological interpretations and moral exhortations. They were taken very seriously by many, including prominent church figures. Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential churchmen of the era, was impressed. Pope Eugenius III, after having a portion of Scivias read to him at the Synod of Trier in 1147 to 1148, gave her papal approval to continue writing and publishing her visions. This was a huge endorsement and protected her from accusations of heresy that could easily be leveled at female visionaries. Hildegard's visionary experiences also extended into the realm of the natural world and medicine. She wrote 2 books on medicine and natural history, Physica, Book of Simple Medicine, and Causae et Curae, Causes and Cures. In these, she detailed the properties of plants, animals, stones, and metals, and offered remedies for various ailments. While some of this knowledge undoubtedly came from existing monastic traditions of herbalism and healing, Hildegard often attributed her insights to her divine visions. She believed that God had revealed to her the hidden healing powers within creation. For example, she would prescribe specific gems to be placed on the body or herbs to be ingested, often with explanations rooted in her visionary understanding of how the cosmos worked. Some accounts tell of people being healed after Hildegard prayed for them or gave them blessed water or bread, attributing these cures to divine power working through her. Beyond writing, Hildegard was a talented composer. She wrote an extensive collection of liturgical music, hymns, antiphons, sequences, collectively known as the Symphonia Harmoniae Celestium Revelationum, Symphony of the Harmony of Heavenly Revelations. She claimed these melodies were also divinely inspired, heard in her visions. Her music is unique for its soaring melodies and wide vocal ranges, quite different from much of the plain cant of her time. She also wrote a morality play, Ordo Virtutum, Order of the Virtues, one of the earliest known examples of its kind, complete with music. Hildegard was a formidable woman. She founded 2 new monasteries, one at Rupertsberg around 1150 and another at Eibingen around 1165. She went on preaching tours, a highly unusual activity for a woman in the 12th century, speaking publicly to clergy and laity, often calling for reform and denouncing corruption. She corresponded with popes, emperors, kings, and other influential figures, offering them advice, warnings, and prophecies, all based on her visions. She wasn't afraid to speak truth to power, even when it was dangerous. She faced challenges, of course. Her visions were sometimes questioned, and she once had a serious conflict with the clergy of Mainz, who placed her monastery under interdict, meaning they were forbidden to celebrate Mass or receive sacraments, because she had allowed an excommunicated nobleman to be buried in the monastery cemetery, claiming her visions told her he had been reconciled with the Church before death. Hildegard stood her ground, and eventually the interdict was lifted. Hildegard of Bingen died in 1179 at the age of 81, leaving behind an incredible body of work that continues to fascinate scholars and spiritual seekers. The accounts of her life and her own writings paint a picture of a woman who believed she was a conduit for divine revelation, seeing fiery secrets and cosmic dramas that she felt compelled to share with the world. Number 3. Lutgardis of Iwer. When heaven touched earth. Picture a young woman whose spiritual experiences were so intense that her body reportedly bled when she contemplated Christ's suffering, or who was said to float in the air while deep in prayer. These are some of the extraordinary claims made about Lutgardis of Iwers, a Cistercian nun and one of the most prominent mystics of the southern Low Countries in the 13th century. Her life, as recorded by the Dominican friar and theologian Thomas of Cantimpré just a couple of years after her death, is a tapestry woven with threads of profound devotion, startling visions, and physical manifestations of her inner spiritual state. Lutgardis was born in Tongeren, in present-day Belgium, around 1182. According to her Vita-like story, she was initially placed in the Benedictine convent of St. Catherine near St. Truiden, not because of a deep religious calling from her, but because a dowry her mother had set aside for her marriage was lost in a bad business deal. At 12 years old, convent life was perhaps more of a practical arrangement. She was described as a pretty, sociable girl who enjoyed the company of her friends and the attentions of visitors. However, something shifted dramatically when she was around 20. One day, while she was reportedly chatting with a friend through the convent parlor grill, Jesus Christ himself is said to have appeared to her. Thomas of Cantimpré writes that Christ showed her his wounds, particularly the wound in his side, and spoke to her, inviting her to a deeper, more exclusive love. This vision had a profound impact. Lutgardis turned away from her more worldly interests and dedicated herself entirely to a life of prayer and penance. Her spiritual life became incredibly fervent, and soon unusual phenomena were reported. She was said to experience frequent ecstasies where she would be wrapped in prayer, seemingly oblivious to her surroundings. During these states, it was claimed she sometimes levitated. Her fellow nuns reportedly witnessed her body rising from the ground as she prayed, suspended in midair, a classic sign of mystical rapture in medieval hagiographies. One of the most striking accounts in her Vita concerns a mystical exchange of hearts with Christ. Lutgardes, feeling that her heart was too full of worldly affections despite her efforts, is said to have asked Jesus in prayer, "Lord Jesus Christ, what do you want with my heart?" According to Thomas, Jesus replied, "I want your heart." Lutgardes then reportedly said, "So be it, Lord, but in such a way that you mix your heart with mine, so that I may possess my heart in you, and it may always remain there secure in your protection." The story continues that Jesus then asked her what she would offer him in return. She is said to have offered her own heart, and this mystical exchange symbolized an ultimate union of love and will between Lutgardes and the divine. Another remarkable set of stories involves physical manifestations related to her empathy with Christ's passion. It was reported that when Lutgardes meditated deeply on the crown of thorns, blood would begin to seep from her own forehead, as if she were physically sharing in that specific aspect of his suffering. This phenomenon, where a mystic experiences physical wounds or pains corresponding to those of Christ's crucifixion, is known as stigmata, though Lutgardes' experience was more localized than the full 5 wounds reported for later saints like Francis of Assisi. Lutgardes also reportedly received other spiritual gifts. She was said to have the gift of healing. People would come to her, or she would pray for them, and they would be cured of illnesses. She was also credited with the gift of prophecy, foretelling future events or knowing things that were happening at a distance. For example, she reportedly knew of the death of a distant abbot at the very moment it occurred. Seeking an even stricter religious life, Lutgardes decided to move from the Benedictine convent to a Cistercian one. The Cistercians were known for their austerity and emphasis on contemplative prayer. Around 1206, she transferred to the convent of Ayuer, near Lillois, south of Brussels. A challenge she faced there was that the community primarily spoke French, while Lutgardes' native tongue was Flemish. This language barrier, however, was said to have deepened her interior life, as she turned more intensely to silent prayer and contemplation. For the last 11 years of her life, Lutgardes was reportedly blind. Rather than seeing this as a tragedy, her biographer portrays it as a spiritual advantage, further detaching her from the world and allowing her to focus even more intensely on her inner visions and relationship with God. She also undertook long fasts, sometimes for 7 years subsisting only on bread and a thin drink, and another period where she reportedly abstained from all food for 40 days before Easter, a feat of extreme asceticism common in the lives of medieval mystics. Lutgardes died in 1246, after predicting the date of her own death. Thomas of Cantimpré, who knew people who had known Lutgardes and who greatly admired her, wrote her Vita Lutgardes shortly thereafter. This biography became very popular and was instrumental in spreading her fame. The stories it contained, of levitation, mystical heart exchanges, bleeding in sympathy with Christ, healings and prophecies, painted a vivid picture of a woman whose life was perceived as a point where heaven dramatically and physically touched the earth. Number 2. Clare of Assisi, the saint who faced down an army. Clare of Assisi, born Chiara of Verduccio in 1194 into a wealthy, noble family in Assisi, Italy, was not someone you'd expect to become a radical champion of poverty or a figure credited with military-like miracles. Yet her life story, deeply intertwined with that of her famous contemporary, Francis of Assisi, is filled with accounts of unwavering faith leading to extraordinary events, including one where she reportedly repelled an entire army of soldiers, inspired by the preaching of Francis, who had renounced his own wealthy background to live a life of poverty and service to God. Clare, made a dramatic decision. On the night of Palm Sunday in 1212, at the age of 18, she secretly left her family's comfortable palace. She went to the little chapel of the Portiuncula, where Francis and his first followers received her. There, Francis cut off her long, noblewoman's hair, and she exchanged her rich gown for a simple, rough habit, vowing herself to God. This was a scandalous act for a young woman of her standing. Her family was furious and tried for weeks to force her to return home. But Clare, with Francis's help, resisted. She was eventually settled at the Church of San Damiano, just outside Assisi, a dilapidated church that Francis himself had rebuilt. Soon, other women, including her own sister Agnes, and later even her widowed mother, joined her. This was the beginning of the Order of Poor Ladies, later known as the Poor Clares. Clare's vision for her order was radical. They would live in complete poverty, owning nothing, not even collectively as a community, relying entirely on alms and God's providence. This privilege of poverty, as she called it, was hard-won, as it went against the common practice of monasteries holding property to support themselves. Clare lived an enclosed life of prayer, manual labor, and extreme austerity at San Damiano for over 40 years. She was known for her deep humility, her care for her sisters, and her intense devotion to the Eucharist, the consecrated bread and wine believed by Catholics to be the body and blood of Christ. It is this devotion that features in her most famous reported miracle. The story takes place around the year 1240 or 1241. Assisi was under threat. Frederick, who, the Holy Roman Emperor, was at odds with the papacy, and his armies, which included bands of Saracen, Muslim archers, were ravaging the Italian countryside. These soldiers were particularly feared for their ferocity. One day, a troop of these Saracen soldiers scaled the walls of San Damiano, which lay outside the main city defenses, and were about to invade the cloister. The nuns were terrified. Clare, who was ill at the time and confined to her bed, reportedly remained calm. According to the accounts in her canonization process, the official church investigation into her life and holiness, and later, hagiographies like the Legend of St. Clare, she asked to be carried to the door of the refectory, which faced the cloister garden where the soldiers were advancing. She then had the sisters bring her the pyx, a small, typically silver or gold-gilt container that held the consecrated Eucharistic host. Holding the pyx before her, Clare prostrated herself on the ground in prayer, begging God to protect her sisters, whom she called poor ladies. She reportedly prayed aloud, "Behold, my Lord, is it possible you want to deliver into the hands of pagans your defenseless handmaids, whom I have nourished with your love? I pray you, Lord, protect these your handmaids, whom I am not now able to protect." A voice said to be as clear as that of a child reportedly answered from the pyx, "I will always protect you." Clare then rose. Still holding the pyx aloft, she faced the approaching soldiers. The accounts state that the soldiers who had been scaling the walls and were ready to pillage and attack were suddenly struck with an inexplicable terror. Those who had already climbed into the cloister were reportedly blinded or dazzled by a light emanating from the pyx, or simply overcome with fear at the sight of the frail nun and the sacred object she held. They turned and fled, scrambling back over the walls as quickly as they had come. San Damiano was saved. This wasn't the only time Clare was credited with protecting Assisi. A short time later, Baitali da Varsa, another imperial commander, laid siege to the city of Assisi itself. The city was in dire straits. Clare, from her sickbed in San Damiano, gathered her sisters for prayer. She encouraged the citizens of Assisi to do penance and pray. According to the tradition, as a result of her prayers and the prayers of her community, the besieging army, for reasons that were not entirely clear to them, lost heart or faced internal divisions, and the siege was lifted. The city of Assisi was spared. Another type of miracle attributed to Clare involved the multiplication of food. The nuns at San Damiano lived in extreme poverty, often not knowing where their next meal would come from. One story tells of a time when there was only a single loaf of bread in the entire convent to feed 50 sisters. Clare, with her unwavering faith, instructed that the loaf be broken and distributed. As the pieces were given out, the bread reportedly multiplied, so that every sister received a sufficient portion. Clare of Assisi died in 1253 after a long illness, finally receiving papal approval for her strict rule of poverty just days before her death. Her life was one of quiet, enclosed devotion, yet the stories that emerged from San Damiano spoke of a woman whose faith was so powerful it could seemingly turn back armies and provide for her sisters in their time of need, all through prayer and a profound trust in the divine. Number 1. Christina the Astonishing, the woman who defied death repeatedly. If there was ever a story from the medieval ages that sounds like it was ripped from the pages of a bizarre fantasy novel, it's the life of Christina of St. Truiden, better known as Christina Miraculous, or Christina the Astonishing. Born around 1150 in Brustum, near Liege, in what is now Belgium, her life, as documented by Thomas of Cantimpré in his Vita Christinae Mirabilis, is so packed with extraordinary, almost unbelievable events that she truly earned her nickname. Christina was orphaned at a young age and lived a simple life as a shepherdess. Then, sometime in her early 20s, she apparently died. She suffered a severe seizure, and after it passed, she was pronounced dead. Preparations were made for her funeral. It was during the funeral mass itself, as her body lay in an open coffin in the church, that the first astonishing event reportedly occurred. According to Thomas of Cantimpré, who claimed to have gathered his information from people who knew her or witnessed these events, as the Agnus Dei, Lamb of God, was being sung, Christina's body suddenly sat bolt upright in the coffin. Then, to the absolute shock and terror of everyone present, she reportedly levitated, soaring upwards like a bird to the very rafters of the church. The priest, understandably shaken, ordered her to come down. Christina obeyed, descending as gracefully as she had risen. When questioned about what had happened, Christina's explanation was even more astounding. She said that when she died, her soul had indeed left her body. She claimed to have been taken on a tour of the afterlife. She saw the grim torments of hell, the cleansing fires of purgatory, and the radiant joys of heaven. She was then, she said, given a choice. She could remain in heavenly bliss, or she could return to earth to suffer and perform penance to release souls from purgatory and to convert sinners through the example of her suffering. Christina, moved by compassion for the souls in purgatory, chose to return to life. She also explained her dramatic flight to the rafters by saying she couldn't bear the stench of sinful human bodies in the church after having experienced the purity of heaven. From that day forward, Christina's life became a series of extreme and often terrifying acts of penance and what appeared to be superhuman feats. Her behavior was so erratic and bizarre that many people thought she was possessed by demons or simply insane. She fled from human contact, saying she was tormented by the smell of sin. She would climb to the tops of trees, towers, or any high place to escape it. She reportedly subjected her body to unbelievable tortures. Thomas of Cantimper writes that she would throw herself into blazing furnaces and remain there for extended periods, yet emerge either completely unharmed or with burns that healed with miraculous speed. She would immerse herself in the freezing waters of the Meuse River in the dead of winter for hours, even days, sometimes allowing herself to be carried downstream by the current caught on mill wheels, yet survive. Witnesses reported seeing her roll her body through thorny bushes until she was covered in blood, or allow herself to be chased by dogs that would bite and tear at her flesh, only for her wounds to heal rapidly. She was said to have lived in remote, wild places, sometimes seeking shelter in ovens, when they weren't lit presumably. Though given her fire exploits, who knows? She was even seen on occasion hanging from gallows among the bodies of executed criminals, or deliberately dislocating her limbs only for them to be restored. Naturally, people tried to intervene. She was captured and imprisoned several times, sometimes by concerned friends or relatives, sometimes by authorities who thought her a public menace. But she would often escape in inexplicable ways, or her attempts at penance would continue even in confinement. For instance, it was said that even when bound, she would contort her body into painful positions or refuse all food except, at times, what was divinely provided, such as a strange, sweet liquid that reportedly secreted from her breasts. This latter detail led some to see her as a Eucharistic mystic, sustained by God alone. Despite the shocking nature of her actions, not everyone thought Christina was mad or demonic. Some, including holy men and women, came to believe that her sufferings were genuinely undertaken for the salvation of souls, as she claimed. Thomas of Cantimper himself, while acknowledging the strangeness of her life, presented her as a unique kind of saint whose path to holiness was unlike any other. He notes that at times, a sweet fragrance was said to emanate from her body, especially after her ordeals, which was often considered a sign of sanctity. Towards the end of her life, Christina's behavior reportedly became somewhat calmer. She accepted a place in the convent of St. Catherine in Saint-Truiden, the same one Lutgardis initially joined, though their times there likely didn't overlap significantly, where she lived more quietly, though still known for her deep piety and occasional prophetic utterances. She died around the year 1224, at the age of about 74. Her story, filled with levitation, apparent immunity to fire and ice, and a resurrection from her own coffin, remains one of the most extreme and astonishing accounts in all of medieval hagiography. A testament to a faith so intense it seemed to shatter the boundaries of normal human experience,